To avoid being forced into an arranged marriage with the daughter of a rival crime family, a union designed to seize control of his territory, Salvatore Rizzo needs a wife within 48 hours. His unexpected choice is Mia, a bartender who accidentally witnesses one of his brutal executions and is kidnapped to keep her silent. You are listening to a story exclusively narrated on the Mafia Romance channel. Relax and step into the world of love stories filled with mystery, emotions, and passion. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment to support us. The Blackbird Lounge smelled like bergamot and spilled bourbon, and Mia Hale had learned a long time ago that the smell of money was almost always the smell of trouble. She wiped down the mahogany bar with the kind of tired, mechanical motion that came after a 10-hour shift, watching the reflections of the city lights swim in the polished wood like something drowning. It was 2 in the morning. The lounge was supposed to be closed. She should have left an hour ago. She should have clocked out with the rest of the staff, should have taken the back stairwell into the alley the way she always did, should have gone home to her cramped apartment above the laundromat, and fallen asleep to the hum of dryers 2 floors down. Instead, she'd stayed to finish the inventory count because her manager, Renzo, had asked her to as a favour, and Mia Hale was the kind of woman who still believed favours meant something. She would think about that irony for a long time afterwards, that the last ordinary night of her life ended because she was too kind to say no. The private room in the back of the Blackbird wasn't supposed to exist on the official floor plan. Mia had worked there for 8 months and had never once seen the door behind the false bookshelf open. She hadn't known it was a door until it swung wide and voices spilled out into the hallway she was crossing with a crate of empty bottles. She should have turned around. She would replay that decision 1,000 times too, the half-second where her body hesitated, curiosity winning some ancient, foolish war against instinct. Through the gap in the door, she saw a man in a chair, wrists bound with black cable ties, his face swollen and wet with blood, one eye already sealed shut. And standing over him, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dark hair falling over a face that belonged on the cover of a magazine no one would dare put him on, was a man who looked like he'd stepped out of an oil painting about the fall of empires. Salvatore Rizzo. She didn't know his name yet. She only knew, with the kind of certainty that lives in the base of the skull rather than the mind, that she was looking at something that could kill her simply by existing in the same room as her. He said something in a low voice, almost gentle, the way you'd speak to a dog you were about to put down out of mercy. The bound man begged. Mia didn't hear the words. Her pulse was roaring too loud in her own ears, but she heard the tone, the pleading cadence of a man who understood he was already dead and was only negotiating for the manner of it. Then Salvatore Rizzo picked up a pistol from the table beside him, unhurried, almost bored, and put a bullet through the man's forehead. The sound was smaller than Mia had expected, a flat crack swallowed instantly by the soundproofed walls. The crate slipped from her hands. 2 bottles hit the carpet and didn't break, but the third rolled out into the doorway's sliver of light, glass ringing softly against the floor like a bell tolling for her. Every head in that room turned. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Mia stood frozen in the hallway in her black apron, staring at a dead man's slumped body, and then at the man who had killed him, and some distant, disbelieving part of her brain thought, absurdly, that his eyes were the colour of a stormy sea, grey-green and utterly still, the eyes of someone who had made peace with violence so long ago it no longer touched him at all. "Cazzo!" someone muttered. Salvatore didn't raise his voice. He set the gun down on the table with a soft click, like a man setting down a glass of wine, and said in English so smooth it barely carried an accent, "Bring her in." Two men in dark suits moved before Mia's legs remembered how to run. One had her by the arm before she'd made it 3 steps down the hall, and she screamed. She would later be embarrassed by how undignified it sounded, how much it sounded like every horror movie victim she'd ever rolled her eyes at, and was dragged, kicking, back into the room with the dead man and the monster who'd made him that way. "Please," she said, the word tearing out of her before she could stop it. "Please, I didn't see anything. I swear to God, I didn't see anything." "You saw everything." Salvatore's voice cut through her babbling like a blade through silk, quiet but absolute. He hadn't moved from beside the body. He looked at her the way a man might look at an unexpected variable in an equation he'd already solved. Faint irritation layered over something colder and more calculating. "That's the problem." "I won't tell anyone. I don't even know who you are." "You will." He said it flatly, an observation rather than a threat, which somehow made it worse. "Everyone knows who I am. Eventually." Mia's eyes darted to the door, to the men flanking it, to the dead man's motionless hand still curled in his lap, as if reaching for something that would never come. Her whole body was shaking, some primal animal part of her screaming that she was in a room with a predator, and there was no version of this night that ended with her walking out the front door and forgetting it had happened. "What do you want from me?" her voice cracked. Salvatore studied her for a long moment, too long, longer than made sense given the body cooling 6 feet away from him, longer than any sane person would spend looking at a terrified bartender when there was a corpse to dispose of. Something moved behind his eyes, some calculation clicking into place that she couldn't read and wouldn't understand for days. "Take her," he said finally, to the man holding her arm. "Don't hurt her. Bring her to the car." "Boss, I said don't hurt her." For the first time, something sharpened in his voice, a warning aimed at his own men rather than at her, and it confused Mia so much that for a moment she forgot to be afraid. "She's coming with me." "Kidnapping," Mia said, half a laugh clawing up out of her terror, hysterical and disbelieving. "You're actually going to kidnap me?" Salvatore Rizzo looked at her one more time before he turned to walk out, stepping over the dead man's outstretched legs without so much as glancing down, as though he were stepping over a fallen branch on a sidewalk. "Call it whatever helps you sleep tonight, signorina," he said. "You're not going home." The car was black, the windows tinted so dark the city outside dissolved into a smear of amber light and shadow, and Mia sat rigid in the back seat, with a man's hand loosely but unmistakably wrapped around her wrist, as if he expected her to leap from a moving vehicle. Perhaps she would have if she thought she could survive it. Salvatore sat across from her, not beside her, his long legs crossed at the ankle, looking out the window like a man returning from a mildly tedious business dinner rather than an execution. Up close, in the wash of passing streetlights, she could see the details she'd missed in her panic. The fine stitching on his black suit, a thin scar bisecting one eyebrow, the way his jaw was permanently set, as if he'd forgotten how to unclench it. He was younger than she'd expected, 34, maybe 35, too young to carry the kind of stillness he wore like armor. "You're not going to explain yourself," she said, when the silence became unbearable. "No. You just shot a man in front of me, and now I'm in a car with you, and you're not going to explain a single thing." "You don't need explanations. You need to survive the next 48 hours, and for that, you need to listen." He finally looked at her, and there was something almost clinical in his gaze, an engineer assessing a structural problem. "What's your name?" "Why does it matter what my name is, if you're going to kill me anyway?" Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, more the ghost of one, gone before she could be sure it existed at all. "If I wanted you dead, you'd already be dead, Signorina. A bullet is cheaper than what I'm about to offer you." "Offer me." "Your name." She almost refused out of spite, but there was something about the flat patience in his voice, the sense that he would simply wait in silence until the end of time, if that's what it took, that made her cave. "Mia. Mia Hale." "Mia," he repeated, testing the shape of it, and something about hearing her own name in his low, accented voice made her stomach twist in a way she refused to examine. "You're going to marry me?" The words hit the air and hung there like smoke. Mia stared at him, waiting for the punchline, the cruel twist that would make this into the sick joke it had to be. His expression didn't change. He wasn't joking. "I'm sorry, what?" 29 hours from now, my father's oldest ally, Dominic Farrow, is expecting me to announce an engagement to his daughter, Isabella. It's been arranged since we were children, a merger, not a marriage. If it happens, the Farrow family gets a controlling stake in every port, warehouse and shipment lane that belongs to the Rizzo family. My father is dying, Mia, and he thinks tying my hands to Isabella Farrow's is how he saves the empire he built. I disagree. He said all of this the way another man might recite a grocery list, and that unbothered cadence terrified her more than shouting would have. "I need a wife by tomorrow night. Someone who isn't already owned by another family, who has no ties to organized crime, who can disappear into the role convincingly enough to buy me time to dismantle the arrangement properly. You witnessed something you shouldn't have. That makes you a liability I have to manage regardless. It also makes you useful. You want to marry me instead of killing me. I want to marry you as an alternative to killing you, yes." He said it so plainly that for a moment she almost laughed, the sound catching somewhere between hysteria and disbelief in her throat. It solves two problems with one signature. "You're insane." "I'm efficient." He leaned forward slightly, and the movement brought him close enough that she could see flecks of dried blood on his shirt cuff, close enough to smell cedar and gunpowder, and something warmer beneath it that she hated herself for noticing. "You have two choices, Mia. You marry me, live in comfort, wear my ring, smile for cameras, and in 6 months, when this is resolved, I give you an annulment and enough money to disappear anywhere in the world you want. Or you refuse, and I have no further use for a woman who's seen my face over a body, and you understand what that means. You'd really kill me." "I've killed men for less," he said, and there was no boast in it, only exhaustion, the tired honesty of a man who had long since stopped pretending to be anything other than what he was. "Don't ask questions you don't want honest answers to." Mia's hands were shaking in her lap. Outside the window, the city had begun to thin into hills, gated estates rising in silhouette against a sky bruised violet with the coming dawn. She thought of her mother, 3 years gone, the apartment above the laundromat, the tip jar she'd been saving toward night classes, the entire small, unremarkable life she'd built, stitch by careful stitch. And how easily, how instantly, a man in a blood-stained shirt had reached out and unravelled it. "If I say yes," she said slowly, testing each word like a step on unsteady ice, "what happens to me?" "You become Mrs. Rizzo. You live in my house. You wear my ring. In public, you are adored." His voice dropped, quieter now, almost private. "In private, you are safe. I don't touch what's mine without permission, Mia. Not like that. This is a contract, not a cage." "It sounds exactly like a cage." "Then it's a comfortable one." He sat back, the brief intensity receding behind that same unreadable stillness. "You have until we reach the house to decide." Mia turned to the window, watching the wrought iron gates of an estate swing open ahead of them, revealing a mansion lit gold against the dark like something out of a fever dream, and understood, with a sick, sinking certainty, that there had never really been a choice at all. The house was enormous in the way that made Mia feel like a trespasser in her own skin. Marble floors that swallowed the sound of her footsteps, a staircase that curved up into shadow, chandeliers dripping crystal like frozen rain. A woman with silver hair and sharp eyes met them at the door, introduced only as Elena, and did not ask a single question about why her employer had arrived home at 4 in the morning with a stranger in a bartender's uniform and blood-flecked hands that weren't her own. "She'll need a room prepared, and a wardrobe." Salvatore said it without looking at Elena, already unbuttoning his cuffs as he walked, as if this were the most mundane request in the world. "We're announcing an engagement tomorrow evening." If Elena was surprised, she didn't show it. "Yes, sir." Mia stood in the foyer, feeling like a piece of furniture being appraised for placement, anger finally beginning to crack through the numb shock that had carried her this far. "You could at least pretend to ask me what I want in my own wardrobe." Salvatore paused at the base of the stairs and turned, and for the first time since the blackbird, something like genuine attention settled on her. Not the assessing, clinical gaze from before, but something sharper, more curious. "You have opinions about clothing, but not about being kidnapped." "I've accepted the kidnapping is happening, whether I have opinions or not. The wardrobe, apparently, I still get a say in." The corner of his mouth twitched again, that same ghost of amusement, gone as quickly as it came. "Elena. She'll want to see the options herself." "Of course, sir." He climbed 2 more stairs before Mia found her voice again. "Wait. You never told me if I said yes." He looked down at her from the landing, dawn light beginning to bleed grey through the tall windows behind him, and something in his face went, briefly, almost unguarded. "You're still here," he said. "That's your yes." She wanted to argue that fear wasn't consent, that being marched through a mansion at gunpoint-adjacent circumstance didn't constitute agreement. But she was tired and cold and horribly, undeniably alive, and some small, traitorous part of her recognized that he was right. She hadn't run. She hadn't screamed for the gate guards. She had walked through the door of her own captivity, because the alternative, spelled out so plainly in his flat, matter-of-fact voice, had been a bullet she had no intention of taking. There are rules, he said, before disappearing up the stairs, which Elena will explain. Learn them quickly. The Pharaohs will be watching everything you do from the moment your engagement is announced, looking for a crack to exploit. Don't give them one. The rules, delivered by Elena over strong coffee in a kitchen larger than Mia's entire apartment, were surgical in their simplicity. Mia was never to be photographed without Salvatore beside her. She was never to discuss the family's business, ever, with anyone, under any circumstance, even if she believed the conversation to be harmless. She was to learn the names of 6 senior capos and their wives within the week. She was to sleep in the East Wing, in a room adjoining but separate from Salvatore's, connected by a locked door for which only he held the key. She was never, under any circumstance, to leave the estate without a security detail. "And if I refuse any of this?" Mia asked, turning the coffee cup slowly between her palms. Elena's expression didn't shift, but something in her eyes softened, just slightly, the flicker of a woman who had clearly seen more than she ever spoke of. "Mr. Rizzo is not a cruel man, whatever you may have seen tonight. But he is a careful one. The rules exist to keep you alive, Miss Hale, not to punish you. He killed someone in front of me, tonight, hours ago." "Yes." Elena said it simply, without flinching, without apology. "And if you had been anyone else, you would already be dead too. Consider that before you decide how afraid to be of the rules." Mia sat with that thought long after Elena left the kitchen, staring out at the pale gold light spreading over manicured hedges and a pool the colour of the Caribbean, and understood, with the slow dawning clarity of someone waking from a long fever, that she had stepped through a door into an entirely different world, one with its own laws, its own gravity, its own brutal, elegant logic. And somewhere upstairs, behind a locked door for which only he held the key, slept the man who now owned every hour of the 48 that remained before her old life closed over her head like water. She thought of her mother's voice, worn thin by years of double shifts, telling her once that some doors only open one way. Mia had never understood what she meant, until now, standing in a stranger's kitchen in stolen silence, already beginning, despite every instinct screaming otherwise, to wonder what kind of man could hold a gun so gently and speak of marriage in the very same breath. By noon, 3 women had arrived from a boutique Mia had only ever seen photographed in magazines, rolling in racks of silk and lace like an invading army. She stood on a small platform in what Elena called the morning room, arms raised, pins pressed against her ribs, while a seamstress with a mouthful of clips murmured measurements to an assistant. Salvatore appeared in the doorway sometime past 1, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled, phone pressed to his ear in low, rapid Italian that Mia couldn't follow, but understood the shape of. Instructions, threats, negotiations, all delivered in that same unhurried, glacial tone. He ended the call and stood watching her for a long moment before the seamstress noticed him and startled. "Mr. Rizzo, we didn't—" "Continue," he said, and crossed the room to where a velvet box sat unopened on a side table. He opened it without ceremony, revealing a ring that caught the afternoon light like something alive, an emerald-cut diamond flanked by smaller stones, the kind of ring that existed to announce wealth before it announced love. That's obscene, Mia said, before she could stop herself. It's expected. He lifted it from the box and approached the platform, and something in the air shifted. The seamstresses fell silent, exchanged a glance, and quietly began gathering their pins and fabric, melting toward the door with the practiced discretion of staff who understood exactly whose house this was. Within moments, Mia and Salvatore were alone. He took her hand without asking. His fingers were warm and rougher than she expected, calloused in a way that didn't match the tailored elegance of his suits, and she found herself staring at the ring instead of his face, because looking at his face felt suddenly dangerously intimate. "This doesn't mean anything," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "It means everything, to everyone who'll be watching us tomorrow night." He slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, which struck her as unsettling in a way she couldn't quite articulate. Had he guessed her size, or measured her hand while she slept off the shock of the night before, some detail slipping past her without her ever noticing? To us, it means whatever we decide it means. You keep saying things like that, like there's some version of this where it becomes real. His eyes lifted to hers, and for a moment the careful blankness he wore, like a second skin, cracked, just slightly, just enough for her to glimpse something raw and complicated underneath. Exhaustion, maybe, or a loneliness so deeply buried it had calcified into something else entirely. "There isn't," he said. "This is business, Mia. Don't mistake it for anything softer. I don't have room in my life for softer things." "Then why does it matter what I think it means?" He didn't answer. He released her hand, stepped back, and something about the sudden distance felt more revealing than anything he'd said. "The engagement announcement is tomorrow at the Faro Gala. You'll wear white. You'll smile. You'll let me do the talking unless directly addressed, and even then you'll keep it brief. Isabella Faro will be there, and so will her father, and every single person in that ballroom will be looking for a reason not to believe us. Give them none. And if I mess it up, if I say the wrong thing, or look at you wrong, or you won't." He said it with a certainty that startled her, an assurance that felt less like flattery and more like an observation already confirmed. "You didn't run last night. You didn't scream when Elena told you the rules. You've spent one day in a house full of armed strangers, and you're standing here arguing with me about a ring instead of sobbing in a corner. You're steadier than you think you are, Mia Hale." The compliment, if it was one, landed strangely, warming something in her chest she immediately distrusted. She looked down at the ring glittering on her hand, absurdly heavy for something so small, and thought of the life it had just replaced. The apartment above the laundromat, the tip jar, the night classes she'd never take now, the version of herself who would have laughed if you'd told her 24 hours ago that she'd be engaged to a mafia don by sundown the next day. "What happens to Isabella Faro?" she asked. "When you tell her father you're marrying someone else?" Something dark passed behind Salvatore's eyes, gone before she could name it. "That," he said, "is a problem for tomorrow." He left the room without another word, and Mia stood alone on the platform in a half-finished gown, staring at a ring worth more than every dollar she'd ever earned, feeling the strange vertigo of a woman standing at the edge of two entirely different lives, unable to say for certain anymore which one was real. The gown, when it was finished, was ivory silk that moved like water, cut to skim her collarbones and fall in a long, clean line to the floor, elegant in a way Mia had never once been in her life. Elena fastened a diamond bracelet at her wrist with practiced hands and studied her in the mirror with something almost like approval. "You look like you belong to this world," Elena said. "I don't." "No," Elena agreed, not unkindly. "But tonight that won't matter. Tonight you only need to look like you do." The Farrow estate glittered against the dark hillside like a second, smaller sun, cars sweeping up a long gravel drive, lined with topiary, trimmed into shapes too precise to be anything but a performance of control. Salvatore met her at the base of the stairs in a black tuxedo that made him look less like a man and more like a blade sheathed in silk. And when he offered his arm, the gesture felt less like courtesy and more like a soldier arming for battle. "Remember," he murmured as they crossed the threshold into a ballroom ablaze with candlelight and old money. "You love me. Try to look like it. That's a big ask on 24 hours' notice. You have all night to practice." The ballroom swallowed them whole, waiters gliding between clusters of black-tie guests, a string quartet playing something mournful and beautiful beneath the din of conversation, chandeliers scattering light across marble like broken glass. Mia felt every eye in the room find them the moment they entered, felt the ripple of recognition and speculation move through the crowd like wind through wheat, and understood, with sudden clarity, exactly what Salvatore had meant about being watched. Dominic Farrow found them within minutes, a broad, silver-haired man with a smile too wide to be trusted, flanked by a tall, striking woman in crimson, whose eyes swept over Mia with the unhurried thoroughness of an appraiser pricing an object she intended to destroy. "Salvatore." Dominic's handshake looked warm and probably wasn't. "And who is this lovely surprise?" "Mia," Salvatore said, his hand settling at the small of her back with a possessiveness that felt entirely too convincing. "My fiancée." The silence that followed had weight. Isabella Farrow's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes went sharp and cold, a blade drawn and sheathed again in the space of a breath. "Fiancé," Dominic repeated slowly, as though tasting the word for poison. "That's unexpected news, Salvatore, given our understanding." "Understandings change, Dominic. I did try to reach you this afternoon." "You didn't." Isabella's voice was silk over steel. "Or I would remember." "My mistake, then." Salvatore's tone stayed perfectly level, the very picture of a man untroubled by lies caught mid-air. "Mia and I have been together longer than you'd expect. I wanted to be certain before I made noise about it." Isabella's gaze slid to Mia with the deliberate slowness of a predator deciding whether prey was worth the chase. "And where did the two of you meet, exactly?" Mia's pulse spiked. Every rehearsed word Salvatore had drilled into her over the last 20 hours, threatening to scatter like startled birds. She reached for the story they'd built, a chance encounter at a charity function, a slow courtship kept quiet for privacy's sake, and forced her voice into something warm, something soft, something that sounded almost terrifyingly like the truth. "A bar, actually," she said, and felt Salvatore's hand tense fractionally against her back. "I was working." He came in looking like the world's saddest rich man, and I felt sorry for him. For one suspended second, nobody breathed. Then Dominic Farrow barked out a laugh, and Salvatore's mouth curved into something that might have been real amusement, and the tension in the circle broke, just enough for Mia to remember how to exhale. "She's charming," Dominic said, studying Mia now with new, calculating interest. "I can see the appeal, Salvatore, though I confess I always thought you'd choose someone a bit more—" He let the sentence dissolve, the insult implicit. "Someone more like Isabella?" Salvatore said, mild as still water, and something dangerous glittered beneath the words. "I've made my choice, Dominic. I'd ask you to respect it, the same way I've respected every agreement between our families for 15 years. Isabella's eyes met Mia's one last time before she turned away on her father's arm, and in that final glance Mia saw something that chilled her far more than anything Salvatore had said in the car 2 nights before. Not jealousy, not simple anger, but the cold, patient calculation of a woman filing away a grievance she intended to collect on, in full, someday soon. "You did well," Salvatore murmured, once they drifted toward the terrace, away from listening ears. "She hates me." "She hated the idea of you before she ever saw your face." He guided her toward the balcony rail. City lights sprawled below them like a field of fallen stars. "That won't change. What matters is that Dominic believed us. Isabella is smart, Mia, smarter than her father. She'll be the one to watch." Mia looked out at the lights, the ring cold and heavy on her hand, the echo of Isabella's stare still crawling along her spine like something with too many legs. Watch for what? Salvatore didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something quieter, more private, meant only for her. "For the crack," he said, "the one that proves this isn't real." Mia turned to look at him, at the sharp planes of his face, gilded gold by the ballroom light spilling through the doors behind them, and felt something shift dangerously in her chest, some small, foolish, undeniable part of her wondering exactly how wide that crack already was. The wedding took place 9 days later in a private chapel on the estate grounds, small enough to feel almost intimate, despite the 200 guests packed into pews carved from dark oak. Most of them men Mia had never met, whose eyes tracked her down the aisle with the flat, assessing patience of men used to studying threats before they materialized. She wore a gown that had cost more than her mother had earned in a decade, and carried a bouquet of white peonies Elena had chosen without asking her opinion, and walked toward a man she had known for exactly 9 days, whose hand she had felt only twice, once around her wrist in the back of a car, once sliding a ring onto her finger in a room full of fleeing seamstresses. Salvatore waited at the altar in black, his father seated in the front pew in a wheelchair, an oxygen tube beneath his nose, watching his son with an expression Mia couldn't decipher. Pride, perhaps, or something more complicated, the particular grief of a man realizing his plans had outlived his ability to control them. "You look beautiful," Salvatore said quietly as she reached him, and something in his voice suggested he meant it, which unsettled her more than any threat he'd made in the days before. "You look like you're attending a funeral." Close enough. The words were dry, but something flickered at the edge of his mouth, not quite humour, but close. Marriages in my family usually are. The priest's words washed over her in a blur. She caught fragments, promises about sickness and health, about forsaking all others, about a covenant meant to last until death, and found the language obscene in its sincerity, given the truth sitting between them like a third presence at the altar. When it came time for vows, Salvatore's voice didn't waver once, delivering promises he had no intention of keeping, with the same unhurried conviction he'd used to order a man's execution 9 nights before. Mia's own voice shook only slightly. She would wonder, later, whether anyone in that chapel had noticed, whether Isabella Farrow, seated near the back in black instead of the expected polite pastel, seeing everything, missing nothing, had caught the tremor and understood exactly what it meant. You may kiss the bride. It was the moment Mia had been dreading since the invitations went out. She had imagined, in the sleepless hours leading up to the ceremony, that it would be brief and clinical, a press of lips for the cameras, nothing more, the kind of kiss two strangers exchange for the sake of an audience. Instead, when Salvatore's hand came up to cradle her jaw, tilting her face gently toward his, something in his eyes had gone unexpectedly soft, unexpectedly focused, as though, for one suspended second, the entire chapel full of watching eyes had ceased to exist. The kiss was slow, deliberate. His mouth moved against hers with a restraint that felt more dangerous than hunger would have. Careful in a way that made her chest ache with something she refused to name. And when he finally pulled back, his thumb brushed once, briefly, along her cheekbone, a gesture too tender to belong to the transaction they'd both agreed this was. "For the cameras," he murmured, so quietly only she could hear it, and she couldn't tell, in that moment, whether he was reminding her or himself. The reception unfolded in the estate's grand ballroom, an orchestra playing something old and sweeping, while capos and their wives circled the room like sharks testing unfamiliar waters. Mia danced with Salvatore beneath a canopy of white orchids flown in from somewhere she didn't ask about, his hand firm against the small of her back, his other hand wrapped around hers with a grip that felt less like performance and more like anchoring. "Your father," she said quietly, as they turned beneath the lights. "He looks like he doesn't approve." "He doesn't." Salvatore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "He wanted Isabella, wanted the alliance. He thinks I've thrown away 15 years of careful planning for a woman I met in a bar." "Have you?" "Yes." He said it simply, without apology, and something in the bluntness of it startled her more than any lie could have. But it was already my planning to throw away, not his. He forgets that sometimes, forgets that this empire is mine now. Whatever's left of him still believes otherwise. "That sounds lonely." Something flickered across his face, quick and unguarded, before the mask slid back into place. "Everything about this life is lonely, Mia. You'll learn that soon enough." She wanted to ask him more, wanted to press into the crack she'd glimpsed, the tired human weight beneath the cold precision he wore like armour. But Dominic Farrow appeared at the edge of the dance floor with a smile too sharp for celebration, and the moment dissolved into the performance the rest of the night demanded of them. Later, much later, when the guests had thinned and the orchestra had packed away their instruments, Salvatore walked her to the door of her room in the east wing, his fingers still loosely wrapped around hers, the ghost of the day's performance not quite faded from either of them. "Good night, Mrs. Rizzo," he said, and the name landed strangely, foreign and heavy, like a stone dropped into still water. "Good night," she managed, and stood in her doorway long after he'd disappeared behind the locked door connecting their rooms, one hand pressed flat against her own lips, trying to understand why a kiss that meant nothing had left her feeling like the ground beneath her had shifted permanently, irrevocably, out of true. The first week of marriage passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. Breakfasts eaten in near silence across a table long enough to seat 12, Salvatore disappearing before dawn into meetings Mia was never invited to, evenings where he returned smelling of cigar smoke and something colder underneath, his knuckles occasionally split in ways he never explained, and she'd learned better than to ask about. She spent her days learning the shape of her new life, memorizing the names Elena had assigned her, touring the estate's endless rooms, discovering a library that smelled of old leather and lemon oil, where she began, almost by accident, to spend most of her afternoons. It was there, curled into a window seat with a battered copy of a novel she'd found on a lower shelf, that Salvatore found her on the 7th night, standing in the doorway for a long moment before she noticed him. "You read?" he said, as though it surprised him. "I used to, before you kidnapped me into an entirely different life." She marked her page and closed the book, feeling suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. "Now I mostly memorize the names of men who look like they'd enjoy hurting me." "Marco wouldn't hurt you." "Vittorio, possibly, if you insulted his mother." A ghost of dry humour coloured the words, and Mia found herself startled into a small, genuine laugh before she could stop it. Something shifted in Salvatore's expression at the sound, brief, unguarded, almost hungry. "You should laugh more often," he said quietly. "It suits you." "I don't have much to laugh about these days." "No." He crossed the room and settled into the chair across from her, an unusual softening in the set of his shoulders, as though the library itself demanded a different posture than the rest of the house. "I imagine you don't." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling low in the hearth, and Mia found herself studying him in a way she hadn't allowed herself before, the tired lines at the corners of his eyes, the tension he carried in his jaw even in stillness, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire life being what other people needed him to be, rather than what he wanted. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "You can ask. I make no promises about answering." "Why did you really choose me? Out of everyone you could have found in 48 hours, why a bartender who stumbled into the wrong hallway?" Salvatore was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though the answer lived somewhere in the flames. "Because you didn't beg," he said eventually. "Everyone begs. My whole life people have looked at me and seen either a threat to survive or a resource to exploit. You looked at me and saw a man who'd just done something monstrous, and you were terrified. And you still had the nerve to argue with me about being kidnapped." He glanced at her, something raw flickering behind his eyes. "I don't know. It felt like the first honest reaction I'd gotten from someone in years." The confession landed with unexpected weight, and Mia found she didn't know what to say to it, found that some part of her, despite every reason she had to hate him, was moved by the loneliness threaded through his words. "That's a sad way to choose a wife," she said softly. "It's a sad life," he said. "I told you that already." "You could change it. You're powerful enough. Surely there's a version of this where you walk away from all of it." Something hardened behind his eyes, the brief warmth retreating behind familiar walls. There isn't. My father built this family out of blood and debt, and it doesn't let go of the people born into it, no matter how much they might want out. You'll understand that better the longer you stay. How long am I staying, exactly? She hadn't meant to ask it so bluntly, but the question had been sitting in her chest for days, sharp and unresolved. You said 6 months, an annulment, money to disappear. That's still the arrangement. Do you want it to be? The question hung in the air between them, and for a moment Mia thought he wouldn't answer at all. His eyes met hers, something complicated and unresolved churning beneath the grey-green surface, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something low and unguarded that she'd never heard from him before. I don't know anymore, he admitted. Ask me again, in a month. He stood before she could respond, the moment closing over as quickly as it had opened, and paused at the door to look back at her, firelight catching the sharp lines of his face. Good night, Mia. She sat alone in the library long after he'd gone, the fire burning low, his admission echoing in her chest like a struck bell, and understood with a slow and terrifying clarity that the line she'd been so certain existed between performance and something real had already begun, quietly and without her permission, to blur. 3 weeks into the marriage, Salvatore took her to Circe, a nightclub he owned on the edge of the financial district, ostensibly to celebrate a deal closed that afternoon, but really, Mia suspected, because Dominic Farrow had specifically requested their presence at his table that night, and refusal would have looked like exactly the crack Salvatore had warned her about. The club pulsed with bass so low it lived in her sternum. VIP booths draped in crimson velvet, bottle service girls weaving between tables with sparklers hissing atop champagne. Isabella Farrow was already seated when they arrived, in black again, always in black, as if she were perpetually in mourning for something she refused to name. Mia, Isabella said, her smile a blade dressed up as courtesy. How are you finding married life? It must be quite the adjustment, going from pouring drinks to being poured for. It has its moments, Mia said, sliding into the booth beside Salvatore, whose hand found the small of her back with the easy familiarity of a month's practice. I bet it does. Isabella's gaze slid to Salvatore, something proprietary and unhealed in the look. Salvatore, do you remember the summer we were 17? You promised me you'd never marry anyone who couldn't hold her own at a dinner table with my father. I remember you promising a lot of things at 17 too, Isabella. Most of them didn't come true either. The barb landed sharp enough that Isabella's smile faltered for half a second before recovering, and Mia felt an unexpected, fierce satisfaction at the sight of it, some possessive instinct she hadn't known she owned, flaring hot in her chest. The night wore on, champagne flowing, Dominic Farrow holding court with stories that always seemed to circle back to his own cunning, and Mia found herself increasingly aware of Salvatore's hand at her waist, of the way his fingers occasionally tightened when Isabella leaned too close, of the low, dangerous edge that crept into his voice whenever Farrow's men looked at her a beat too long. It was during a lull in the music that a man Mia didn't recognize, young, handsome in a careless way, clearly one of Farrow's people, leaned across the table and asked her to dance. his smile a shade too familiar, his hand extended before anyone could object. "I don't think—" Mia started. "She's not dancing with anyone tonight," Salvatore said, and the temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. His voice hadn't risen at all, but something in it had gone glacial, final, the tone of a man who had already decided the conversation was over before it began. "Relax, Rizzo. It's one dance. Try again," Salvatore said, "and you'll be dancing with the floor instead." The young man laughed, uncertain, glancing at Dominic for cover that didn't come. Pharaoh himself had gone very still, watching his son of a lieutenant with the flat, calculating eyes of a man recalculating a variable he'd underestimated. The moment stretched, brittle and dangerous, until the young man withdrew his hand and sat back with an apologetic mutter that satisfied no one. Later, on the balcony overlooking the dance floor, away from listening ears, Mia turned to Salvatore with her arms crossed. "You didn't need to threaten him like that. He was testing me, testing whether I'd defend what's mine in front of the Pharaohs, or whether the marriage was hollow enough that I'd let another man put his hands on my wife without consequence." His jaw tightened, some old fury simmering just beneath the surface. "I won't let that happen. Not for the sake of the performance. Not at all." "Mine," she repeated softly, something in the word catching in her throat. "Is that what I am? Something you own?" His eyes found hers in the low light, and something shifted there. Something that looked, for one unguarded moment, less like possession and more like fear. The particular terror of a man realizing he'd already lost a war he hadn't known he was fighting. "You're my wife," he said, quieter now. Whatever that started as. "I don't like watching other men look at you like they have a right to." "Because of the performance." "Because of you," he said, and the words landed like something breaking open in her chest, honest and unguarded in a way she hadn't expected from him, hadn't dared to hope for. "I don't know how else to say it, Mia. This stopped being only about the performance somewhere between the wedding and tonight, and I don't know what to do about that." She stood very still, the bass thrumming faintly through the glass beneath her palms, watching a man who could kill without flinching stand before her, looking, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely and helplessly unsure of himself. "I don't know what to do about it either," she whispered. Neither of them moved to close the distance between them, but something had shifted irreversibly in the space between their bodies. A tension that no longer belonged only to danger. And when Salvatore finally reached for her hand and laced his fingers through hers, it felt less like a performance for watching eyes, and more like the truth neither of them had been ready to name. The weeks that followed unspooled with a tenderness Mia hadn't expected to find inside the gilded cage of her new life. Salvatore began coming home earlier. He started seeking her out in the library some evenings, not to discuss business or rehearse their story for the next public appearance, but simply to sit across from her while she read, occasionally asking after the book in her hands with a curiosity that felt entirely genuine. One evening she found him in the kitchen at nearly midnight, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled, attempting, badly, to reheat leftover pasta on the stove, because he'd sent the household staff home early and refused, out of some stubborn pride she found unbearably endearing, to admit he didn't know how to work the burner properly. "You're going to burn the house down," she said from the doorway, biting back a laugh. "I've diffused actual bombs with steadier hands than this stove requires." He glanced up, something sheepish flickering across a face she'd only ever seen composed into careful stillness. Apparently pasta is beyond me. She crossed the kitchen and nudged him gently aside, taking over the pan with the easy competence of a woman who'd spent a decade behind bars, pouring drinks and, before that, cooking dinner for a mother too tired to manage it herself. Salvatore watched her with an expression she couldn't quite name, something soft and unguarded, almost wondering. "You're good at this," he said. "I used to cook for my mum before she got sick." The words slipped out before she could stop them, a piece of herself she hadn't offered him yet. "What happened to her?" "Cancer. 3 years ago." Mia stirred the pasta, keeping her eyes on the pan rather than his face, unwilling to let him see how much the memory still cost her. "I was working 2 jobs, trying to pay for her treatment. It wasn't enough. It's never enough, is it, the trying?" Salvatore was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had dropped into something low and raw she hadn't heard from him before. "My mother died when I was 12, he said. "My father had her killed." Mia's hands stilled on the pan. She turned to look at him and found none of the careful blankness he usually wore, only a grief so old it had fossilized into something else, something that looked almost like resignation. Why? She wanted to take me and leave, wanted a different life for me, away from all of this. His jaw worked, old pain surfacing beneath decades of careful control. "My father found out. He told me, years later, that it wasn't personal, that the family came before everything, even her." He looked at Mia, something fierce and wounded flashing in his eyes. "I was raised by the man who ordered my mother's death, Mia. I learned early that love in this life is a liability. That's why I've never let anyone close enough to use against me." "But you let me close." "I didn't have a choice." A ghost of dark humour coloured the words, quickly swallowed by something more vulnerable. "You saw me kill a man, and instead of running, you argued with me about a ring. I've never met anyone like you. I don't know how to want something without it becoming a weapon someone else can use against me. But I want you anyway, and I don't know what to do with that." The confession hung in the kitchen's low light, raw and unpolished. Nothing like the careful performance he'd trained her to deliver for cameras and capos alike. Mia set down the wooden spoon and crossed the small distance between them, reaching up to press her palm against his jaw, feeling him lean into the touch, like a man starved for exactly this kind of gentleness. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly. "Not because you're forcing me to stay, because I don't want to." Something in his face cracked open entirely then, the last of the careful architecture he'd built around himself crumbling in the warm kitchen light. And he leaned down and kissed her, slow and searching, nothing like the practiced performance of their wedding day. This kiss tasted like confession, like two people finally admitting to a truth they'd both been too afraid to name. When he pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "This isn't part of the arrangement anymore, is it?" "No," Mia breathed. "I don't think it ever really was." Behind them, forgotten, the pasta began to burn. Neither of them moved to save it. Isabella Farrow had not survived 29 years in a house built on knives and loyalty by missing the things other people wanted her to miss. She had watched Mia Hale at the gala, at the wedding, at Circe, cataloguing every small, unrehearsed gesture, the way her father had taught her to catalogue weakness in an enemy's portfolio. And she had noticed, weeks before either Salvatore or Mia admitted it to themselves, the exact moment their performance had stopped being one. She sat now in her father's study, watching him pour 2 fingers of scotch with the slow deliberation of a man who enjoyed rituals more than the things they preceded, and waited for him to acknowledge the folder she'd placed on his desk an hour ago. "You're certain of this?" Dominic asked finally, tapping the folder without opening it. "I had someone at the Blackbird Lounge the night it happened. A busboy who saw the girl dragged into a private room and never come back out the front door." Isabella's voice was cool, precise, the voice of a woman who had learned early that emotion was a currency to be spent deliberately or not at all. "Salvatore didn't fall in love at a charity gala, Papa. He kidnapped a bartender who walked in on an execution and married her within 48 hours to avoid marrying me." Dominic's expression didn't shift, but something behind his eyes sharpened into focus, the look of a man recalculating an entire strategy in real time. "And you're telling me this now, rather than the night of the gala? Because I wanted to be certain it would still hurt when I used it." Isabella's smile was thin and cold. "He humiliated us in front of 200 guests, Papa. He's been humiliating us for weeks, letting that girl play house in his mother's old rooms while our alliance rots on the vine. I want more than an apology. I want leverage." "You want war." "I want what's owed to us." Isabella leaned forward, something feral flickering behind her composed expression. "Think about it. If the truth comes out, if every family in this city learns that the great Salvatore Rizzo married a nobody bartender to dodge an arranged marriage, his reputation collapses. No one respects a man who lets a witness dictate the terms of his own house. His capos will start wondering what else he's weak enough to bend on. That's worth more to us than any wedding ever could have been." Dominic was quiet for a long moment, swirling the scotch in his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the lamplight. "And if we don't merely expose it," he said slowly, "but take her, use her as leverage to force the alliance he refused to give us willingly." Isabella's smile widened, sharp and satisfied. "Now you're thinking like the man who built this family, Papa." "It's dangerous. Salvatore won't take the loss of his wife lightly, whatever her origin. He'll come for us with everything he has." "Let him." Isabella stood, smoothing the front of her black dress with a composure that didn't reach her eyes. "He took something from us the moment he chose her over me in front of the whole city. I intend to take something back. And when he comes looking for his precious bartender bride, Papa, we'll be ready to remind him exactly whose family builds empires and whose only inherits the ashes." Dominic studied his daughter for a long moment, pride and unease warring visibly across his face, before he finally nodded, reaching for his phone. "I'll make some calls. We'll need Vitali's men and a place no one will think to search." "I already have somewhere in mind," Isabella said softly, moving to the window, staring out at the dark hills toward the estate where Salvatore Rizzo slept beside a woman who had no idea yet how quickly the ground beneath her happiness was about to give way. 3 months into the marriage, Mia woke to sunlight pouring through the tall windows of Salvatore's bedroom. Her bedroom now, too, the locked door between them, long since left permanently open, its key discarded in a drawer neither of them had bothered to close again. Salvatore lay beside her, one arm thrown across her waist, his face unguarded in sleep, in a way it never was awake. All the careful architecture of his control dissolved into something almost boyish. She traced the scar bisecting his eyebrow with one gentle finger, and he stirred, grey-green eyes blinking open to find her watching him. "You're staring," he murmured, voice rough with sleep. "I'm allowed. You're my husband." Something warm moved across his face at that, not the ghost of amusement he used to offer, but something fuller, something that had grown steadily over the months since the burnt pasta and the confession in the kitchen. "I like hearing you say that," he admitted. "I didn't expect to." "Neither did I." She settled against his chest, listening to the steady drum of his heartbeat, marveling at how quickly the impossible had become simply true. "Do you remember what you said that night in the library, that you didn't know what you wanted anymore, and to ask you again in a month?" "I remember. It's been 3. He was quiet for a moment, his hand moving slowly along the curve of her back. "I don't want the annulment," he said finally, the words dropping into the morning quiet, like stones into still water. "I know that's not what we agreed to. I know I promised you an exit, money, a life far away from all of this the moment it was safe. But I don't want any of that anymore, Mia. I want you. I want this. Waking up next to you, arguing about stoves, watching you read in the library with your feet tucked under you, like you belong there. I've never wanted anything the way I want this to be real." Mia's chest ached with the force of hearing it said aloud, the things she'd felt building quietly in her own heart for weeks now, finally given permission to breathe. "It is real," she said softly. "It has been for a while now. I think I fell for you somewhere between the burnt pasta and you threatening to make that boy dance with the floor at Circe." He laughed, a real laugh, low and startled, the sound of a man discovering he was still capable of joy after all. "That's a strange list of romantic milestones." "We have a strange life." "We do." He pressed a kiss to her temple, lingering there. "I love you, Mia. I don't know how to say it more plainly than that. I love you, and I'm terrified of what that means in a life like mine, but I don't want to protect myself from it anymore." "I love you too," she whispered, and felt him exhale against her hair, some long-held tension finally releasing from his body. They spent that morning tangled in unhurried quiet, the outside world, pharaohs, capos, the dying empire waiting for Salvatore's father to finally succumb, held at bay behind locked doors and drawn curtains. And for a few precious hours, Mia allowed herself to believe that whatever danger had brought them together, love had found a way to make something real out of the wreckage. It was the last morning of true peace either of them would know for a long while. Salvatore's father died on a Tuesday in early autumn, the estate falling into the particular hush that follows the passing of a man both feared and resented by everyone who'd ever depended on him. Mia stood beside Salvatore at the funeral, her hand in his, watching him receive condolences from men who had spent decades scheming against the family he now led outright, with no buffer of his father's fading authority left between him and the wolves circling the throne. "They'll test me now," Salvatore said quietly that night, staring into the fireplace in the room that had become, in the months since their wedding, unmistakably theirs. "Every capo who ever wondered whether I was strong enough to hold this family together will look for the first sign of weakness." "And Isabella?" His jaw tightened. "Isabella has wanted my downfall since I called off an alliance she believed was owed to her by birthright. My father's death removes the last restraint keeping Dominic Farrow from moving against me outright. He respected my father, in his own twisted way. He owes me nothing." Mia felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. "What does that mean for us?" "It means I need to be more careful than I've been." He turned to look at her, something fierce and protective sharpening behind his eyes. "I should have hired more security around you months ago. I let myself believe the danger had passed once the engagement story held. It hasn't. If anything, it's just beginning." Over the following weeks, Salvatore's caution hardened into something Mia found increasingly suffocating. A security detail doubling in size, a driver who never let her out of sight, dinners cancelled at the last minute for meetings he wouldn't explain, phone calls conducted behind closed doors in a tone she'd learned meant trouble. She understood the reasons. She hated them anyway. "You're pulling away from me," she said one night, standing in the doorway of his study, watching him pore over ledgers and shipment manifests with the same tired, joyless focus he'd worn the night she met him. "I'm trying to keep you alive. By disappearing into meetings and not telling me anything. By treating me like something fragile that needs to be locked in a tower." Frustration cracked through her voice, months of careful patience finally fraying. "I thought we were past treating each other like pieces in someone else's game." Salvatore set down his pen, and when he looked at her, exhaustion and fear warred openly across his face. The first time she'd seen him fully unguarded in weeks. "Dominic Farrow has been moving assets, reallocating men. My contacts tell me he's meeting with Vitale, an old ally of my father's who's been unhappy with the transition of power since my father died." "I don't know what they're planning, Mia, and that uncertainty is eating me alive. Because the only thing I know for certain is that if they want to hurt me, the fastest way to do it isn't through my territory or my money."
"It's through me."
"Yes." The word came out rough, stripped of all his usual composure. "And I don't know how to protect you from something I can't see coming. I've fought wars, Mia. I've never once been afraid the way I'm afraid now, because for the first time in my life, I have something worth losing." Mia crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers, feeling them tremble slightly beneath her grip, an admission more honest than any words could have been. "Then let me help you," she said softly. "Stop trying to protect me by shutting me out. Let me stand beside you instead of behind glass." He looked at her for a long moment, something breaking and mending simultaneously behind his eyes, before he finally nodded, pulling her into his lap and burying his face against her shoulder, like a man seeking shelter from a storm he could feel building on the horizon, but couldn't yet name. Neither of them could have known, in that fragile, tender moment, that the storm was already far closer than either of them feared. The invitation arrived on cream cardstock, embossed with the Farrow family crest, a charity gala benefiting a children's hospital, hosted jointly in an unusual gesture of goodwill by the Farrow and Vitale families.
Salvatore turned it over in his hands at the breakfast table, something wary settling behind his eyes.
It's a peace offering, Mia said, reading over his shoulder. Isn't it? A public gesture, cameras, charity. It's exactly the kind of thing that would smooth things over after the funeral. It's exactly the kind of thing Isabella would use to lure us somewhere with the appearance of safety, Salvatore said grimly. But refusing would look worse. It would signal weakness or guilt or both. Every capo in this city is watching to see how I handle the transition of power. If I hide from a children's hospital gala, I might as well hand Dominic Farrow my territory on a silver plate. So we go. We go. But you don't leave my side, not for a moment. Not for the bathroom, not for a drink, not for anything. His voice had hardened into the flat, commanding register she hadn't heard directed at her in months, and something in it made her chest tighten with old fear. The gala, held at the Bitalia family's downtown hotel, glittered with the same practiced opulence as every event Mia had attended since her wedding. Except this time, she felt eyes on her from every direction, a prickling awareness of danger she couldn't quite locate. Isabella found them within the first 20 minutes, dressed in emerald green instead of her customary black, her smile wide and warm in a way that immediately set Mia's nerves on edge. "Mia," Isabella said, embracing her with unexpected warmth. "You look wonderful. Married life clearly agrees with you." "Thank you," Mia said carefully, glancing at Salvatore, who watched the exchange with tightly coiled suspicion. "I owe you both an apology, actually," Isabella continued, her voice pitched for sincerity. "I was cruel after the engagement announcement. Jealousy, I suppose, though it's embarrassing to admit. I'd like to make amends, if you'll let me. There's a smaller reception upstairs, just family and close allies, away from all these cameras. I'd love for you to join me, Mia. Just us, a few minutes, so I can apologize properly without an audience." Every instinct in Mia's body screamed a warning, but Salvatore's hand tightened briefly around hers before he spoke, his voice carefully neutral. "We'll both come." "Oh, I was hoping for just Mia, honestly. It feels strange to apologize to a wife with her husband standing guard over her, don't you think? Like I can't be trusted." Isabella's laugh was light, disarming. 10 minutes, Salvatore. I promise she'll be back before you finish your first drink." Salvatore's jaw tightened, and Mia could see the calculation working behind his eyes. Refusing would look paranoid, controlling, exactly the kind of weakness his rivals were watching for. Agreeing meant releasing Mia from his sight for the first time in weeks, in the one place he'd promised never to let that happen. 10 minutes, he said finally, something reluctant and pained in his voice. "I'll be right downstairs, Mia. If anything feels wrong, you call for me." "I will," Mia promised, squeezing his hand once before following Isabella toward the private elevator, a cold thread of unease tightening in her stomach with every floor they climbed. The upstairs reception room was empty when they arrived. No family, no allies, no champagne waiting on ice. Just Isabella, her smile finally slipping into something colder and more honest, and 3 men in dark suits stepping out from behind a screen, blocking the only door. "Isabella," Mia's voice cracked with sudden sharp fear. "I really was going to apologize," Isabella said softly, almost wistfully, as one of the men produced a syringe from his jacket pocket. "But then I remembered how much more satisfying it will be to watch Salvatore Rizzo burn his entire empire to the ground, trying to get you back." Mia opened her mouth to scream, but a hand clamped hard over her lips before the sound could escape, and the last thing she saw before the needle found her arm and darkness swallowed her whole was Isabella's face, calm and triumphant, mouthing two words with cruel, quiet satisfaction. "Checkmate, Salvatore." Salvatore checked his watch at the 9-minute mark, a tight, coiling dread building in his chest that he recognized with growing horror as the same instinct that had once told him a deal was about to go wrong seconds before the first shot was fired. At 11 minutes, he was already moving toward the private elevator, ignoring the capos who called after him, ignoring Dominic Farrow's oily greeting halfway across the ballroom floor. The reception room was empty, champagne unopened on ice, chairs pristine and unused, no sign that anyone had been there at all, except for a single earring, Mia's, the pearl drop he'd given her for their 1-month anniversary, lying discarded on the marble floor beside an overturned side table. "Mia!" Her name tore out of him, raw and desperate, echoing off the empty room's high ceilings, and for the first time in 15 years, Salvatore Rizzo felt something close to true panic clawing up his spine. He found Marco in the hallway outside, radio already pressed to his ear, expression grim. "Boss, security footage from the service elevator. 3 men, masks, moved her out through the loading dock less than 5 minutes ago. No plates on the van." Isabella. The name came out of Salvatore like a curse, like a vow. "Where is she?" "Gone. Left right after the elevator doors closed on you two." Salvatore's mind raced through every scenario, every possible location, every ally and enemy who might know where Isabella Farrow would take a woman she intended to use as leverage against him. He thought of his mother, of the 12-year-old boy who'd learned that love was a liability the day his father's ambition had cost him the only person who'd ever loved him unconditionally, and felt that old grief crash into a new, sharper terror, the horrifying possibility of history repeating itself with Mia's name where his mother's had once been. "Get everyone," he said, voice gone flat and lethal, in a way that made even Marco, a man who'd killed for the family for a decade, take an involuntary step back. "Every soldier, every ally, every favor we're owed. I want Dominic Farrow's entire operation turned inside out by morning. I want to know where Isabella sleeps, where she eats, who she trusts, and I want to know within the hour. Boss, if we move against the Farrows without proof, it's war. Full war. Every family in the city will. They already have my wife." Salvatore's voice cracked just once before hardening back into something merciless. "The war already started, Marco. They just haven't seen what it looks like when I stop holding back." He tore through the ballroom moments later, ignoring the stares of 200 guests, and found Dominic Farrow at the bar, sipping scotch with the calm, unbothered expression of a man who either knew nothing or had rehearsed his ignorance perfectly. "Where is your daughter, Dominic?" Salvatore's voice was quiet, which made it more terrifying than shouting ever could have been. "I couldn't say. Isabella comes and goes as she pleases these days." Dominic's eyes glittered with something that might have been genuine surprise, or might have been the practiced innocence of a man who'd learned long ago never to know too much. "Is something wrong, Salvatore? You look pale." "Your daughter just kidnapped my wife from a room 10 feet from where you're standing, Dominic, and if I find out you knew, I will burn every port, warehouse, and dollar your family has ever touched to ash, and I will enjoy every single second of it." Dominic's composure finally cracked, something like genuine alarm flickering across his face. "I had no knowledge of this, Salvatore. I swear on my late wife's grave." "Then find your daughter," Salvatore said, already turning away, his voice a low and terrible promise. "Before I find her first." He left the ballroom without another word, the eyes of 200 guests trailing after him, whispers already spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The great Salvatore Rizzo, undone in a single night, his careful empire cracking open at the one point he'd never armoured properly, the woman he loved. Outside, in the cold autumn air, Salvatore stood beside his car and allowed himself, for exactly 10 seconds, to feel the full weight of his terror. Then he buried it, the way he'd buried every soft thing in himself since he was 12 years old, and became, once more, the man this city feared above all others. He was going to get her back, whatever it cost. Mia woke to the smell of concrete and mildew, her wrists bound to the arms of a metal chair, a single bare bulb swinging gently overhead, casting long, shifting shadows across a room that looked like an abandoned warehouse office. Her head throbbed from whatever they'd injected her with, her mouth dry and cottony, and for a long, disorientated moment, she couldn't remember how she'd come to be here at all. Then the memory crashed back. Isabella's cold smile, the syringe, the 2 words mouthed with cruel satisfaction, and fear closed around her throat like a fist. "You're awake." Isabella's voice came from the doorway, and Mia turned her head to find the other woman leaning against the frame, arms crossed, watching her with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing an experiment. "Good. I was worried Vitale's men used too much sedative. That would have been such an anticlimactic way for this to end." "What do you want?" Mia's voice came out rougher than she intended, fear and fury tangled together. "I want what I was always owed. Salvatore's territory, his loyalty, his father's alliance, all the things he threw away the moment he chose you over a lifetime of careful planning." Isabella crossed the room slowly, crouching in front of Mia's chair with an almost gentle expression that made the words that followed all the more chilling. "You're just the tool that gets it back for me. Once Salvatore signs over control of his shipping lanes and dissolves his claim to the Northern Territories, you'll be released, unharmed even, if he cooperates quickly." "He'll never agree to that." "He will." Isabella's smile was small and certain. "I've watched him for months, Mia. I've seen the way he looks at you, the way no one has ever seen Salvatore Rizzo look at anyone in his entire life. He'll burn his own empire down before he lets anything happen to you. That's the tragedy of it, really. Love makes even the most dangerous men predictable." "You're wrong about him." "Am I?" Isabella stood, smoothing her dress, moving toward the door. "We'll find out soon enough. In the meantime, get comfortable. This might take a few days. Salvatore isn't the type to rush an important decision, even under pressure. And I intend to make this decision as painful as possible for him." The door closed with a heavy metallic clang, leaving Mia alone in the dim, swinging light, her wrists raw against the restraints, fear and fury, and something else, a stubborn, burning determination, warring inside her chest. She thought of Salvatore's face that morning 3 months ago, unguarded in sleep, the way he'd told her he loved her with a rawness that had nothing to do with performance. She thought of his hands trembling in hers the night he'd admitted his fear of losing her. The fierce, protective ferocity that had grown in him since the wedding, replacing the cold stillness she'd first mistaken for the whole of who he was. He would come for her. She believed that with a certainty that surprised her, a faith built not on naivety, but on the accumulated weight of months spent learning exactly what kind of man lived beneath the monster she'd first seen in that back room at the Blackbird Lounge. But she also understood, with a clarity sharpened by fear, that she couldn't simply wait to be rescued. Not if there was any chance to help herself, to buy time, to weaken whatever trap Isabella had built around her. She began, quietly and methodically, testing the give in the ropes at her wrists, cataloguing the room's single window, the distance to the door, the sound of voices in the hallway beyond, every scrap of information that might, eventually, become a way out. Whatever happened next, Mia decided, gritting her teeth against the pain in her wrists, she would not simply be a bargaining chip in someone else's war. She would be a variable no one had accounted for. By dawn, Salvatore had not slept, had not eaten, had done nothing but pace the length of his study, while Marco and a dozen senior soldiers fed him fragments of information gathered through a long, brutal night of pressure applied to every corner of the Faro and Vitali networks. "We have a location," Marco said finally, spreading a map across the desk. "A warehouse on the old shipping docks, registered to a shell company that traces back to Vitali through 3 layers of paperwork. It's not confirmed, boss, but it's the strongest lead we've got." "Confirm it," Salvatore said, voice stripped of everything but purpose. "I want eyes on that building within the hour." "And if it's a trap? If they know we're coming? Then we spring it anyway." Salvatore's eyes were flat and merciless, the eyes of a man who had stopped calculating risk the moment Mia's earring hit the marble floor. "I am done playing this game by their rules, Marco. Every hour she's in that room is an hour I can't get back. I want Vitale's men to understand exactly what it costs to touch what's mine." The confirmation came within the hour, thermal imaging showing at least 6 armed men inside the warehouse, a single figure bound to a chair in a back office, dark hair matching the woman in every photograph Salvatore had stared at obsessively through the long night. His chest tightened with a savage mixture of relief and fury. "We go in at dusk," he said, "full force. I want every exit covered before a single shot is fired inside." Dominic Faro called twice during the day, each time with the same practiced, oily concern, insisting he had no knowledge of his daughter's actions, offering to broker a peaceful resolution between the families. Salvatore let both calls go to voicemail. There was no peaceful resolution left to broker. Isabella Faro had made her choice the moment she'd put her hands on Mia, and Salvatore intended to make sure every family in the city understood exactly what that choice would cost. Word spread through the underworld like wildfire that afternoon. The Rizzo family was mobilizing. Soldiers pulled from every territory, weapons distributed, alliances called in from families who'd stayed neutral for years, all of it converging toward a single, unmistakable conclusion. Salvatore Rizzo was going to war, and he intended to burn the Faro and Vitale families to the ground to get his wife back. Several old allies of his father called to offer support, some out of genuine loyalty, others clearly hedging their bets on which side of the coming conflict would prove more profitable to have backed.
Salvatore accepted every offer without sentiment, filing away which allies had come immediately and which had waited to see how the wind blew. Information he intended to remember long after Mia was safely home again. As dusk approached and his soldiers assembled in a warehouse 3 blocks from the docks, weapons checked and rechecked in grim silence, Marco found Salvatore standing alone at the window, staring out at the darkening sky, with an expression more naked than any of his men had ever seen on their boss's face. "You love her," Marco said quietly, not quite a question. "More than I've loved anything in my life," Salvatore said, voice rough. "I spent 34 years making sure nothing could touch me because I had nothing worth losing. I have something now, Marco, and I am going to burn this entire city down before I let anyone take her from me." "Then let's go get her, boss." Salvatore turned from the window, the last softness draining from his face, replaced by the cold, merciless focus of a man about to wage the most important war of his life. "Move out," he said. "And Marco, Isabella Farrow is mine. No one touches her but me." The convoy of black cars pulled out into the gathering dark. 30 armed men converging on a single warehouse where Mia Hale sat bound to a chair, unaware that the empire her husband had built was about to collapse around her captors like a controlled demolition, brick by brick, until nothing remained but ash and the sound of Salvatore Rizzo's voice calling her name. The warehouse assault began with a single precise explosion at the eastern loading dock, a diversion, Marco's idea, drawing 3 of Vitale's guards away from their posts in a panic that lasted exactly as long as it took Salvatore's men to breach the northern entrance in the resulting chaos. Mia heard the explosion from her chair, felt the concrete floor shudder beneath her, and something in her chest leapt with a wild, desperate hope, even as the sound of gunfire began, sharp and close, echoing through corridors somewhere beyond her locked door. Isabella burst into the room moments later, her composed elegance shattered into something feral and panicked, a pistol clutched in one shaking hand. "He found us," she hissed, more to herself than to Mia. "Of course he found us! Of course that bastard found us!" "You should let me go," Mia said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the terror hammering in her chest. "It's over, Isabella. Whatever you thought this would accomplish, shut up." Isabella crossed the room and hauled Mia up by the ropes still binding her wrists, dragging her toward a door at the back of the office, gunfire growing louder, closer, the shouts of men in 2 different languages tangled together in violent chaos. "You're my only leverage left. If I have to walk you out of here with a gun to your head, I will." They made it 3 steps into the hallway before Salvatore appeared at its far end, blood already spattered across his white shirt, a pistol raised and steady, despite the fury contorting his face into something Mia had never seen before. Not the cold stillness of the man who'd executed a stranger in a back room, but something wilder, something entirely unleashed. "Let her go, Isabella." His voice carried down the corridor like a blade drawn from its sheath. "Drop your weapon, or I put a bullet in her skull. I swear to God." "You won't." Salvatore didn't lower the gun, but his eyes flicked to Mia's for one fraction of a second, something desperate and reassuring passing between them in that brief glance.
Because the second you pull that trigger, you lose every scrap of leverage you ever had. And every man in this building loyal to you will realize exactly how alone you are. Put the gun down, Isabella. This ends now, one way or another. You chose her over everything, Salvatore, over your family's legacy, over 15 years of planning, over me. I chose her over a life I never wanted in the first place. His voice cracked, just slightly, the raw honesty of it more dangerous than any threat. I'm sorry it cost you something, Isabella. I never meant for it to be like this. But I will not let you hurt her, not while I'm breathing. Isabella's hand trembled against the gun pressed to Mia's temple, indecision and fury warring visibly across her face, and for one endless, terrible second, Mia thought this was how it would end, in a concrete hallway, in the crossfire of two families' broken promises, a casualty of a war that had never truly been hers. Then Mia moved. She'd spent the last 2 hours working the ropes at her wrists loose, patient and methodical, despite her fear. And in the split second Isabella's attention wavered towards Salvatore, Mia wrenched her bound hands free and drove her elbow hard into Isabella's ribs, twisting away from the gun as it fired wildly into the ceiling, plaster raining down around them in a chalky cloud. Salvatore closed the distance in 3 strides, tackling Isabella to the ground before she could recover, wrenching the pistol from her hand and pinning her beneath his knee with a controlled violence that made Mia's breath catch.
Salvatore, don't...
Mia's voice cut through the chaos, some instinct telling her that whatever happened in the next few seconds would define the man he chose to become for the rest of his life. Don't kill her, please. He looked up at her, chest heaving, blood on his hands that wasn't entirely his own, something raw and conflicted warring behind his eyes. The old, familiar violence he'd been raised in, pulling hard against the man he'd become since falling in love with a bartender who'd wandered into the wrong hallway. Give me one reason, he said, voice ragged, why I shouldn't end this the way my father would have. Because you're not your father, Mia said softly, crossing the distance between them, despite her trembling legs, kneeling beside him amid the plaster dust and gun smoke. And because I don't want to be married to a man who kills out of vengeance instead of necessity. She's finished, Salvatore. Look at her. She has no army left, no leverage, nothing. Let the law, or her father's shame, finish what you don't have to. Salvatore held Isabella's terrified gaze for a long, taut moment, and then, slowly, released the pressure of his knee against her chest, standing and pulling Mia into his arms instead, burying his face in her hair as though she were the only solid thing left in a world that had nearly come apart entirely. I thought I'd lost you, he whispered, voice breaking. I have never been so afraid in my entire life. I'm here, Mia murmured against his chest, feeling his heartbeat hammer beneath her cheek. I'm here, Salvatore. It's over. Behind them, Marco's men moved in to restrain Isabella, and somewhere beyond the shattered warehouse walls, the sound of sirens began to rise in the distance. The police, alerted by an anonymous call Salvatore had arranged hours before, arriving just in time to find the wreckage of a war that had, against every brutal odd, ended with Mia Heil still breathing.
The days that followed the warehouse blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and quiet, careful healing. Isabella Farrow was arrested on kidnapping charges before the sun rose the next morning, her father's protests drowned out by evidence Salvatore's lawyers had assembled with ruthless efficiency. Surveillance footage, financial records tracing Vitale's involvement, testimony from soldiers eager to distance themselves from a losing side. Dominic Farrow, humiliated and cornered, agreed within a week to formally dissolve any remaining claim on Rizzo territory, in exchange for Salvatore's agreement not to pursue the matter further, a peace bought with the last of the Farrow family's dwindling influence. Mia spent the first 2 days at the estate simply sleeping, Salvatore rarely leaving her side, except when business demanded it, and even then returning within the hour, his phone glued to his palm in case she needed him. She woke on the third morning to find him sitting in the armchair beside their bed, watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before, something fragile, something achingly grateful. "You've been staring at me sleep again," she murmured, voice still thick with rest. "I keep needing to confirm you're actually here." His voice was rough, unguarded. "I keep waking up from nightmares where I didn't make it to that warehouse in time." Mia reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together, feeling the faint tremor still present in his grip. "You did make it. I'm here." "I know." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss against her knuckles, with a tenderness that had nothing to do with performance, and everything to do with a man relearning, slowly, how to breathe. "I've spent my entire life believing that love was a weakness my father exploited to control the people around him, Mia. Watching you disappear taught me something different. It taught me that love isn't the weakness. It's the reason worth fighting for in the first place." "That's very poetic for a man who once told me softness had no place in his life." A ghost of his old dry humour flickered across his face, warmth chasing away some of the haunted shadows that had settled there since the warehouse. "I'm allowed to have grown, Mia. You've been a terrible influence on my carefully maintained emotional constipation." She laughed, a real laugh, unguarded and warm, the first since the kidnapping, and something in Salvatore's chest visibly eased at the sound, as though her laughter alone was proof enough that the world had righted itself. "What happens now?" she asked, when the laughter faded into something quieter. "With the family, I mean. With Isabella's charges, the Farrows, all of it." The Farrows are finished as any kind of threat. Dominic spent everything he had trying to protect his daughter, and what's left of his territory will be absorbed by families still loyal to me within the year. Isabella will face trial. I imagine she'll spend a long time in prison unless her lawyers find some miracle I haven't accounted for. His expression darkened briefly before softening again. "And the family, my family, the empire my father built, needs someone to run it who isn't consumed by the same cruelty that killed my mother and shaped my entire childhood into something I've spent years trying to unlearn." "You." "Me. But different." He met her eyes with a quiet, determined resolve. "I've spent the last week thinking about what kind of man I want to be now that I have something worth protecting beyond territory and reputation. I want to run this family the way my mother would have wanted, if she'd survived long enough to see it, with less bloodshed, less cruelty, more of the kind of loyalty that isn't bought with fear. I don't know if it's possible to change an empire built on violence into something less monstrous. But I want to try. for you, for whatever life we build together after all of this. Mia's chest tightened with emotion, watching a man who had once executed a stranger without a flicker of hesitation speak now of mercy and change with the same quiet conviction. "I believe you can," she said softly. "I've watched you become someone different these past few months, Salvatore. Softer in the ways that matter, stronger in the ways you needed to be. I don't think that change is finished yet, but I believe in where it's headed." He pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers, and for a long moment they simply breathed together in the quiet morning light. Two people who had survived something that should have destroyed them, finding instead that it had forged something unbreakable between them. "Marry me again," Salvatore murmured suddenly, the words startling a soft laugh out of her. "We're already married. Not like this. Not under a false pretense, not with an audience of capos and rivals watching for weakness. I want to marry you properly, Mia. Just us, whoever we choose to invite. Vows that mean exactly what they say, instead of a performance for people who never deserved to witness something real." His eyes were bright, hopeful in a way that transformed his entire face. "Let me give you the wedding I couldn't give you the first time. Let me marry the woman I actually love, instead of the stranger I was terrified into choosing." Mia felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, overwhelmed by the tenderness of the offer, by how far they'd travelled from that first terrified night at the Blackbird Lounge to this quiet, healing morning. "Yes," she whispered. "God, yes. 1,000 times yes." They married again 6 weeks later, on a cliffside overlooking the sea, an intimate gathering of perhaps 40 guests instead of the 200 watchful strangers who had filled the chapel the first time. Elena cried openly through the entire ceremony, and Marco, standing as Salvatore's best man, wore an expression of such fierce, unguarded pride that Mia found herself moved to tears more than once, just watching him watch his boss finally become, fully, the man he'd always had the capacity to be. Mia wore a simpler gown this time, ivory silk without the ostentatious diamonds, her hair loose and wind-tossed by the sea breeze, and when she walked towards Salvatore along a path scattered with white rose petals, she found him waiting, with tears openly shining in his eyes. No careful mask, no performance, nothing held back. "You're crying," she murmured, when she reached him, reaching up to brush a tear from his cheek. "I'm allowed," he said, echoing her own words back to her with a small, broken laugh. "I spent my whole life believing I'd never get to feel something like this. Let me feel it." The vows they exchanged that day bore no resemblance to the hollow promises delivered in a chapel full of strangers months before. Salvatore spoke of the night he'd nearly lost her, of the fear that had taught him more about love than 34 years of careful emotional armour ever had. He spoke of watching her cook dinner in his kitchen and understanding, for the first time in his life, what it meant to build something instead of merely defending it. He promised her not power, not protection alone, but partnership. A life built together rather than a cage constructed for her safety. Mia's own vows trembled with emotion as she spoke of the terrified bartender who'd stumbled into a back room and found, impossibly, the love of her life waiting on the other side of that terror. She spoke of watching a cold, dangerous man slowly unlearn the cruelty his childhood had taught him, choosing gentleness instead, choosing her instead, again and again. In 100 small moments, neither of them had noticed accumulating into something unbreakable. "I love the man you've become," she said, voice thick with emotion, "and I am endlessly grateful for the terrifying, impossible night that brought us together."
I would relive every second of fear if it meant arriving here, at this exact moment, married to you, truly, completely, with nothing false left between us. When they kissed this time, there were no cameras waiting to capture the performance, no rival family watching for weakness, no careful choreography rehearsed for an audience that never deserved the truth of what passed between them. There was only the sound of the sea below the cliffs, the warmth of the autumn sun, and two people who had survived a war neither of them had chosen, finding on the other side of it something real enough to build an entire life around. That evening, at a reception far smaller and warmer than their first, Salvatore stood to give a toast, his voice steady despite the emotion still evident in his eyes. "A year ago," he said, raising his glass, looking only at Mia, "I believed love was a weakness that got the people I cared about killed. I built my entire life around that belief, brick by careful brick, until I became someone I barely recognized, efficient, cold, alone in every way that mattered. Then a bartender walked into the wrong hallway on the worst night of my life, and instead of running from the monster she found there, she argued with me about a ring." Laughter rippled through the small crowd, and Salvatore's mouth curved into a smile that had nothing guarded about it at all. "She taught me that love isn't the weakness my father believed it to be. It's the only thing worth building an empire around. Mia, thank you for surviving me. Thank you for choosing me, again and again, even when I gave you every reason not to. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret it." Mia rose to meet him, tears streaming freely down her face, and kissed him in front of everyone they loved, no performance left in the gesture at all, only two people, finally, entirely, exactly where they were always meant to be. A year later, Mia stood on the balcony of the estate she now called home, without hesitation, watching the sun set gold over hills that had once felt like the walls of a gilded prison, and now felt, simply, like the view from her own front porch. Salvatore joined her, sliding his arms around her waist from behind, resting his chin against her shoulder in the easy, unguarded way that had become as natural to him as breathing. "Marco tells me the northern territories finally stabilized," he murmured against her hair. "The last of the old guard who resented my changes have either come around or moved on. It's quieter now, steadier. Less bloodshed," Mia said, covering his hands with her own where they rested against her stomach, rounded now, gently, with the child they'd learned about 3 months before, a piece of news that had reduced Salvatore Rizzo, feared don of an empire built on violence, to quiet, overwhelmed tears in the middle of their kitchen. "Less bloodshed," he agreed. "More of what my mother would have wanted, I think. I like to believe she'd be proud of what we've built out of everything my father tried to make certain of." Isabella Farrow's trial had concluded 8 months prior, resulting in a lengthy prison sentence that had effectively ended any remaining Farrow influence in the city. Dominic, humiliated and diminished, had retreated entirely from the underworld, his territory long since absorbed by families now loyal to Salvatore's quieter, more measured leadership.
The old capos who had once whispered about weakness now spoke, when they thought no one important could hear, about how much more stable the Rizzo family had become since its Don had married a woman capable of teaching even a hardened killer how to choose mercy over cruelty. "Do you regret it?" Mia asked softly, turning in his arms to look up at him, the same question she'd asked once before, in a different life, a different version of them both. "Any of it? The wedding you never wanted, the marriage that started as a cage?" Salvatore's expression softened into something that held no trace at all of the cold, unreadable stranger who had once put a bullet through a man's skull without flinching, then turned that same unbothered gaze on a terrified bartender and calmly proposed marriage as an alternative to murder. "I regret every hour you spent afraid of me," he said quietly. "I regret every day I let you believe you were simply a liability to be managed, instead of the answer to every question I never knew how to ask about what my life could become. But the marriage itself—" He shook his head, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead, then her temple, then finally, softly, her lips. "That night at the Blackbird Lounge was the worst night of my life, Mia. And it gave me you. I would relive every terrifying second of it, every risk, every war it cost us, if it meant arriving here again, on this balcony, with our child growing beneath your heart, and no lie left standing between us." Below them, the estate's gardens stretched gold and green in the fading light, the same grounds where Mia had once stood terrified on her wedding day, reciting vows to a stranger she believed she'd never truly know. She thought of the ring that had once felt like a shackle, now simply a symbol of a promise both of them had chosen, freely and completely, to keep. She thought of the frightened bartender who had wiped down a mahogany bar 2 years ago, utterly unaware that her ordinary, unremarkable life was about to end, only to discover, on the other side of that ending, an entirely different kind of beginning. "I love you," she said, simple and complete, the words no longer carrying any weight of performance, any need to convince watching eyes of anything at all. "I love the man you were brave enough to become." "I love you," Salvatore answered, "more than I ever believed myself capable of loving anything. Thank you for staying, Mia. Thank you for teaching a monster how to be a man worth loving." The sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and on that quiet balcony, in the empire he had rebuilt from something merciless into something capable, finally, of tenderness, Salvatore Rizzo held his wife and the promise of the family they were building together, and understood, at last, that the most dangerous thing he had ever done was also the truest, loving her, without armor, without hesitation, for the rest of the life they now shared. Some doors, Mia had once believed, only opened one way. She knew now that she'd been wrong. The door that had closed behind her on that terrified night 2 years ago had not been an ending at all. It had been, all along, the only way home.